So which Necron units has the new Codex been kindest to? Today we're going to try and separate the wheat from the chaff with a bit of a tier ranking. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. The Necron Codex has been out for a good few weeks now, and people have had a bit of chance to put some units and combos together. With that in mind, I thought I'd try and rank the Necron units in a rough sort of tier ranking, starting with the units that are weakest in game in the lower tiers, and moving on to what I think are some of the strongest units in the Codex. As always with these tier rankings, different people have different playstyles and different ideas about what sort of things are strongest. If you think that I've ranked something too low or too high, feel free to let me know down in the comments. For the purposes of this review, we're going to focus on the Necron's actual damage dealing units, rather than focusing too heavily on their support characters. I feel like it's a bit meaningless comparing a support character who does good buffs compared with a gun platform that does X amount of damage. We're basically going to ignore the HQ section in this review, maybe we'll come back to it at another point. Until then though, let's jump straight into it, starting with the lowest tier, Tier 4. Now Tier 4 is where I've placed a bunch of units that are really struggling in this edition, I think. First up we have the Annihilation Barge, who can certainly put out quite a lot of Tesla shots, but is really hurting for a little bit of AP in the current meta. There are quite a lot of Space Marines about, and this guy's damage output is always going to be pretty underwhelming against power armor, even if you're Mefrit or something. He's fairly tanky, but not the strongest at the moment in my opinion. Next we have the Obelisk, the Lord of War that's very tanky, though doesn't really do much in terms of offensive damage output. It can amp up its damage output from the Tesla spheres if it remains stationary, but then that does mean that it's very inflexible as to what it can target, as they're quite short ranged. I'm just not sure this low level of damage output is ever going to justify its points cost and the command point tax for fielding it as a Lord of War. Next we have the Convergence of Dominion, the Necron fortifications with a short close range shooting attack, and provides a leadership buff and command protocols to nearby Necron infantry units. While they're really cool models, I just don't think they're really going to justify their price tag in most competitive Necron lists. For me they're just a little bit easy to ignore, and they can potentially get locked up in close combat. Next we have the Canoptic Reanimator, which is a very frustrating unit for me. The buff that this guy provides is very good, getting +1 to reanimation protocols, but unfortunately he's just not going to live to use it very much. He's just ridiculously fragile point for point, with only a toughness of 5 and 6 wounds. He's just trivially easy to remove, so unless you can manage to hide him out of line of sight for the first few turns while also providing his buffs, you'll be basically throwing quite a lot of points down the drain. Finally, and quite disappointingly, I've put the Hexmark Destroyer down here. This is the guy with the 6 pistols who can deep strike in and shoot down a lot of enemy infantry. Unfortunately his damage potential just really doesn't add up. He costs 75 points, and on the turn that he drops with those pistols, he'll kill around about 1 Space Marine, or maybe 6 or 7 models out of a Horde unit, depending on how many he finishes off, so he actually gets to shoot more shots. If he can find some 1 wound infantry with low saves to take out, who are sufficiently expensive, he could be worth it, but there's just so many matchups where he's just not going to be particularly effective. Perhaps one of the best uses of him is to be able to get command protocols on another deep striking unit, though if he's solo I think he really struggles to stand on his own 3 feet. So getting a little stronger, here are the units that I've chosen to include in Tier 3. First up we have 2 Catan Shards, the Catan Shard of the Deceiver and the Transcendent Catan. Now the Necrodermis rule combined with Living Metal is just really powerful, and if played fairly carefully then these guys should last for the majority of the game. I think that their biggest issue though is they're just massively overshadowed by the other Catan, and as you can only take 1 per detachment, it really means that they're going to see a lot less play. I just think that they're not going to have quite as much impact on the game as the high damage outputs of the Void Dragon and the Nightbringer. Next I've chosen to rank the other 2 super heavies here, the Monolith and the Tesseract Vault. Both of these have a lot more offensive punch and mobility compared with the Obelisk. The Tesseract Vault can throw all of its mortal wounds around, and the Monolith has some nice movement shenanigans with warriors and other core units, and can also punch pretty hard in close combat surprisingly with that Portal of Exile. I think that the majority of Necron lists are going to struggle to justify the command point cost of including them in a Lord of War detachment though, but it might be fun to see if anyone manages to make Monoliths work in a big super heavy detachment where you're taking 3 of them in one list. Next we have the Night Scythe, which I think does have its uses, but I feel like you are paying a bit of a premium for the abilities that it brings. Its AP 0 damage output with Tesla will be good against some hordes and things, but be very underwhelming against power armor, and I think to take one you really want to be making the best use out of its transport capacity, perhaps beaming in a big squad of warriors with Gauss Reapers, or perhaps delivering some Triarch Praetorians or Lich Guard. I don't think we're likely to see any mass Night Scythes like we did back in 5th edition, but perhaps one for a delivery system for a hard-hitting unit could be justified. Finally, I've chosen to rank the Locust Heavy Destroyer unit down here. I do find these guys really quite interesting. They have a reasonable amount of range damage output, but just point for point their durability is quite underwhelming. Only 4 toughness 5 wounds at 70 points really isn't the best, and I don't think that they'll be ever taken too heavily in one army. Maybe 3 single units of 1 in a Zarakan army, or perhaps 1 unit of 3 to camp in the backfield and hopefully jump around while remaining safe from enemy fire. So now let's move on to Tier 2 then. I have chosen to include quite a lot of units from the Necron army here, which I think fits with my opinion of the book in general. Most of the units do tend to be fairly usable, at least in niche roles, and a lot of units that will be fairly underwhelming unsupported can get very strong if you actually layer a lot of buffs on them. We'll start at the bottom for this one and make our way towards the top, where I put a few more of the units that I think were certainly pushing towards Tier 1. First up we have Deathmarks with their new ballistic skill 2+, and their very fancy strength 5 guns. For me they're a pretty decently pointed Necron sniper unit. Take enough of them and they'll certainly pose a decent threat to enemy HQ choices, though unless they are plinking away at enemy characters, their damage output isn't going to be exactly overwhelming. Next we have the Triarch Stalker, which can be a decent unit in a shooty Necron list. Its damage output is kind of okay, but I think the main reason to include it is focusing your fire on one target and allowing you to reroll ones for other Necron units. I think it's pretty powerful the way that this doesn't just rely on being core units either, so you could potentially buff things like Doomstalkers and Doomsday Arcs and other heavy guns. Next we have the many-bladed Necron murder machines that are flayed ones, a unit that can make good use of reanimation protocols and buff some units like the Chronomancer. These guys are basically the favoured children of the Novok dynasty, with extra AP on their blades and being able to fight twice can easily make a big unit of them cut through near enough any target in the game. If they don't have too big a stack of buffs though, then it does mean that they can be a little bit underwhelming against anything with a very good saving throw. Canoptic Spiders have really come into their own again in the new edition. 60 points seems a pretty decent price for their stat line. They're actually quite decent in melee now, can potentially net you some free scarabs as the game goes on, and can be upgraded to either repair vehicles or deny psychic powers for a nominal points cost. Not a bad hardy little unit to have in the centre of your battle line. The new deep striking Ophidian Destroyers are an interesting one. They're very much a glass hammer, very hard hitting melee unit whose main weakness is that they're not going to stick around too long once they've actually hit combat. They're a very reasonable deep strike melee threat, but for starting on the board I'd be a bit more tempted by the Scorpec Destroyers. Their extra strength, toughness and armor save values really do just put their damage output and durability to the next level. I feel like Locust Destroyers are a superior option to the Heavy Destroyers for the most part. Their Gauss cannons are just generally very good all-purpose weapons, they're a bit tougher point for point, and you can hide one of the Locust Heavy Destroyers within the unit. A unit of 4 of these with a Heavy Destroyer in is really quite a good target for the Extermination Protocol stratagem for 2 command points, allowing you to reroll all wound rolls for the unit, which will pretty much guarantee you melt whatever you target, whether it's a bunch of heavy infantry or a high toughness vehicle. Next up we have the Doomsday Arc, Doomstalker and Doomscythe. Aside from all having the name Doom in the title, they fulfill a fairly similar battlefield role, being dedicated fire support units with one really big gun to melt enemy tanks. I did a comparison of the Doomstalker and Doomsday Arc in another video, so feel free to check that one out if you'd like to, but I'd generally say that they both have their pros and cons, and in general point for point they have fairly similar damage output and durability. The Doomscythe is a bit different. Being a flyer it's not going to be scoring objectives or anything, but there is some value to being able to move quite so far, maybe jump behind the enemy battle lines and take out backfield units with those Tesla weapons, or perhaps surprise a luckless enemy character with that heavy death ray which will melt through most targets. I've chosen to put the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon in here as well. I feel like it's generally going to be a lot more use than the other two. That Spear of the Void Dragon is really good in melee, it's got a 3+ armor save which is helpful, and if your opponent happens to take many tanks or vehicles in their army then he's going to have a really good time. For me he's just not quite as general purpose or destructive as the Nightbringer, which is why he's ranked here rather than in tier 1, again due to only being able to take 1 Catan per detachment. I know the Silent King has quite a lot of value as a buffing character, but he's also quite a good damage dealing character in his own right, with some insanely powerful shooting and melee, and the very helpful advantage of making opponents fight last. Combined with his buffing abilities, I think he's actually fairly well balanced at his very high price tag of 450 points. It's certainly a unit that you'll have to build around to get the most out of him, but decently strong if you do so. We're now getting to some of the general purpose units that I really think could have justified going in tier 1, and have some good synergy within the Necron Codex. Immortals are a solid battle line unit, and I could certainly see small squads of them being used as objective campers, where they're more in powerful shooting, it's just going to be a bit better than warriors if you're not thinking about investing in a huge unit. In general though, in the troops section, I think they are going to be generally overshadowed by the warriors though. Being able to take huge units of them is really good with reanimation protocols. Their Gas Reapers are exceptionally efficient at close range, and for those reasons I think that the Immortals are slightly edged out. Next up we have a couple of dedicated melee units, Scorpec Destroyers and Wraiths. I feel like both of these are very interesting units for the Necron army, both decently durable and very fighty in melee. The Wraiths may be going slightly further down the durability route with their invul saves, and the Scorpec Destroyers being a very decent threat to enemy tanks as well as just heavy and light infantry. I describe them both as very strong Necron battle line units. I think it's rarely going to be a wrong choice just advancing either of these into the midfield. If your opponent has to shoot them before they get into combat, then at least they'll draw fire away from other assets. In particular, in 9th edition for objectives, Wraiths with objectives secured could be really powerful, as you can get that with one of the custom dynasties. Next we have Tomb Blades, who I think are really quite a cool and powerful unit in 9th edition, and it's quite helpful that they're one of the core Necron units as well, so can better receive buffs from all sorts of sources. They've got a lot of what you want in a competitive unit, decent firepower, very decent movement, and a fair amount of customization as well, depending on whether you take Gauss or Tesla, or the various upgrades that they can get. I honestly think that we'll see quite a few of them in competitive Necron lists. Finally, we have some of the elites of the Codex, Triarch Praetorians and Lichguard, both of which are units I strongly consider running one big squad of in a competitive list. The Praetorians are decently fast, have very solid damage output with those Rods of the Covenant, and can go to a whole nother level if you have the Silent King nearby. Lichguard on the other hand can either go for maximal damage output with a whole unit of War Scythes, or just put down a really tanky unit in the midfield by taking the Hyperphased Swords and Dispersion Shields. They'll still cut up infantry admirably, but also gaining a 2+ save and 4+ invul means they're not going to go anywhere. Finally, before we move on, I'd just like to give a shout out to Crypto Thralls here. I'd also put them at tier 2 on the higher end of the spectrum as well. I guess you could see them a bit more of a character upgrade and bodyguard type unit, but to be honest, point for point, the damage output that they can put out in close combat is really quite spectacular, and if I was taking Cryptex in the army, I would most certainly consider them. Finally, we get to tier 1, some of the units that I think are strongest in the Codex, and I think will be very near auto-includes in a lot of Necron army lists. First of all, unsurprisingly, we have the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer. We have talked about him before on the channel, but he's just an absolute nightmare for your opponent to deal with. Living Metal plus Necrodermis means he's not going down for turns and turns. His Gaze of Death is arguably one of the best Catan powers, allowing you just to pile more mortal wounds on a unit that he can see. And his melee output really is second to none. That side of the Nightbringer is likely to bring down virtually any character in one round of combat, as invul saves are absolutely no protection at all. If played well, it's pretty much guaranteed to be a problem for your opponent on the table, and there's something very scary about a model that you can't kill that you know is going to deal significant damage to your units. Next we have the humble Canoptex Scarab Swarms. These unsung heroes of the Necron army list can be very strong with rushing forward to take objectives, and perhaps some of the best recipients of that custom dynasty buff where you get the pre-game move and objective secured. For scoring objectives in 9th edition, these guys are point for point a real pain to shift. If you fire anti-infantry weapons against them, then you'll be met by 20 wounds for 75 points, which is very efficient, and if you fire anti-tank against them, then you're sort of wasting it compared with shooting more high-value targets. Much like Nurglings in Chaos lists, it's sometimes the little guys that win the games by stealing the objectives. Finally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Necron Warriors are up here as well. And I've chosen to include the Ghost Ark here if you choose to take them with them, as a really solid transport unit with some repair abilities. I think the majority of Necron lists will be building around warriors in some sort of respect, and just so much of the Codex is built around making Necron warriors stronger with all the buffs that they can receive. You can really make them pretty terrifying between things like a Chronomancer save for a 5+ invul, +1 to hit from Overlords, repairing them with Cryptex, and Resurrection Orbs to hopefully make half the squad get straight back up again. With those Gauss Reapers on the new profile as well, they have the potential to be really quite good damage dealers. Say using a big squad of 20 of them, and using Veil of Darkness to move across the board is going to give you a crazy amount of Strength 5 close range firepower. With the proper setup, I think that Necron Warriors can be very scary indeed. So there we have a brief run through of some of the stronger and weaker units in the Necron army list, and my reasoning for each. As I said, I know it's very subjective, so feel free to let me know your opinions for whether or not I should have ranked something higher or lower in your opinion. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more content like this. I'll certainly be hoping to do plenty more Necron videos over the next few weeks. Finally, if you have been enjoying the channel and would like to help support creating new videos, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page which you can find down in the video description below. Channel Patreons get a few advantages, such as seeing new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway which happens at the start of each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.